active when you can live. Let's see now. I really should put a thumbtack in there. There we go. Working on this today. Lower. Okay. Get out. I need you to go to bed now. Not to bed, just kind of like, you know, lay here. No, I don't want to ask the survey.
Walls with windows being speckled across them in seemingly random intervals. More regularly spaced along their bottom were titanic doors, within which smaller doors of progressively diminishing sizes were integrated. And the only entrance and exit to this plaza was formed by enormous archways in what must have been the cardinal directions of the station, even though that concept lost its meaning on a space station. James was in awe as he marvelled at the gigantic walls around him, feeling like an ant in the middle of the Colosseum must feel. He had only seen them in pictures so far, and they didn't do its sheer size any justice.
Quite the sight to see, isn't it?
The councilman Castellangas commented, chuckling, and looked along the bright walls himself as he stepped up next to James.
It's a shame that they stopped using it before my time. I would have loved to work here.
I can imagine, James mumbled, as he took in the sight with the same gawking gaze that all the other tourists surrounding him right now had on their faces. And he hoped he would be forgiven for that. After all, he stood in the middle of history here. They stood in the middle of the first Galactic House of Councils, also lovingly dubbed the Great Community Palace. It was here that the different precursors and vague core alliances were formed into the Galactic Community proper for the first time, and where it was governed for many years to come after. Only after the community, and with it its council, had grown too large to be housed in this building anymore, which was hard to imagine given the palace's sheer size, had been retired and turned into a museum and tourist attraction, after an entire news station had been built specifically to house the future Galactic Council.
Beautiful.
Sadly, we don't have time to actually go inside today,
Madame Tour stated, looking down at Jane specifically as she looked around.
but I can highly recommend going through it at your own time. Since you represent a species that wasn't around for our community's humble beginnings, it could give you some insights into the lengths the first member species went through to build a bright and accommodating future for every member species.
Indeed.
I can't stop the rain. Either go outside or not.
Not to learn about the past, which he could do comfortably from his own room. Just to walk along this massive structure and take in everything that it entailed. As he let his eyes wander along the walls one more time, something met his eye. There was a plaque along one of them, hanging high up. It was made of some matte, goldish metal, and was slightly withered by age. He had mistaken it for the shutters of one of the weirdly shaped windows before. However, now he could clearly see that there was something written on there instead. Success to you, prosperity for all, unity in the community. He read out loud, straining his eyes to make out the letters so far above his head.
Quite the motto, isn't it?
Castellangas spoke back up as he looked up towards the plaque with a shaky neck.
It's a shame people never use the whole thing. There's such a nice sound to it. Nobody has time to say the full thing every time.
Agifionora responded impudently, and waved it off with her trunk. Maybe people should take the time more often, Repeat reminded her, standing off to the side of it. It could remind them what the community is about. Councilman Accordo made a seemingly agreeing gesture to that, the mini veeling on his skin shaking around. The community's motto, huh? James repeated to himself. He was sure he had read that before somewhere, but it hadn't really registered to him until now. A bit embarrassing given that he had been using its beginning as a form of goodbye for months now.
It is our honor and privilege to work under it every day,
Castellangas said with an almost nostalgic tone.
Always striving to make the community the place our ancestors envisioned when they built this place.
There it was.
I don't need surround sound.
It must be hard working as a representative for an entire galaxy, James commented coyly, and looked over to the large old man. If I'm being honest, I'm not even quite comfortable representing just my own species. The old man chuckled.
Once you're being reinstated for 30 times, it becomes second nature, my boy,
he said softly and looked down at James. James remembered hearing that before. Hadn't the matriarch said something similar during their first meeting? Excuse my ignorance, but what exactly does it mean to be reinstated? He asked. As he clearly had something about the way the community was being run.
Love you.
He got a mix of bemused and disapproving looks in response. His lack of common knowledge seemed to either amuse or not at all amuse the people present. After a while, it was Reprieve of all people who spoke up to explain to James. The Galactic Council and other important positions, such as Leader Supreme, are elected quarter-yearly into their respective positions, he said in an almost annoyed tone, disapprovingly wiggling his trunk around as he spoke. But since elections on a galaxy-wide scale are quite cost and labour-intensive, it was decided early on in the community's history that a reinstatement system would be best suited to handle the workload. Instead of running a proper election every election cycle, it is instead first voted on reinstating the already present council. If the majority of people are in favour of keeping the current council, there is no sense in wasting money and effort on a full election just to have the same people re-elected anyway. Going by his tone, he thought something along the lines of, "How did you ever become ambassador?" Which was a fair question, given
Oh my
that
god, what?
James looked at him for a moment. Having grown up on that.
Okay, come on. Oh, come on. There we go. This is what you want? This is what you want? You want snuggles? Does this make you happy? My clay is drying before I can sculpt it, but as long as you get your snuggles. Do you need to go to the vet? Your fur isn't shiny anymore. You're not oily. Grease ball. Do you have kidney problems? Liver? You don't like my cooking? Oh, you get a little... There we go. Got it. You're a weird cat. You like your hair pulled. Kinky bastard. Fuck, you're drooling now. Hello. Welcome to the live stream. We're having a cat break right now because apparently somebody needed some love. Apparently I'm a neglectful cat owner, and the only way he can get my attention besides sitting on me whenever I sit down or sleeping on me all night or chasing me around the house is by interrupting my crafting. So we need a moment. If you're new to live stream, this is Ghetto. Yeah. I really need to finish putting the neck on. Can you let me do that? You're gonna let me do that? If I just grab this and you sit there and be loved, I will start doing some lines. That sounded like a drug deal thing, but no, I'm just making some lines to make it. So when it dries, it has the same, a closer texture to the original than you know, smooth. Because there's kind of a ridge here. I'll see if I can put that in. Would you please, just for a few minutes, just give me a second. Yeah, I know, I love you. I love you so much. I had a baby shower gift I gotta get done. I have emails I gotta get done. I am running out of time. You're not helping, but your comfort is enough. Look at the baby. Crafting with cats. How's it working? Seriously, just get comfy. At this point, just get comfy. Your fur is in the clay. Your fur is in the clay. Please stop. Please stop. You're not helping. You're not helping. Come on. Just let me texture. Let me texture, please, Ghetto. Let me texture. Don't throw my things on the ground, or you won't get any wet food this week. There we go. Alright, I got some texture on the neck. Thumbs up if you think Ghetto's a handsome boy. Okay, can I get back to my show now? Can I put you down? Can I get the teapot before the clay dries? Please, get on to work. I'm trying to make you kitty kibble so you don't starve to death. Come here. Alright, we're going to share now. Oh, it's right here. Right here, next to the laptop. Yes. Oh, what a handsome boy. Oh, he fell over. Yep, what a handsome boy. There's absolutely nothing wrong with this. You are such a good boy. Yes, those are claws. Yep, they're very sharp when they sink into my flesh. Okay. Where were we?
He saw all kinds of problems with that system, and he really meant all kinds. He also ran the numbers over in his head, reinstated 30 times, once a quarter yearly. Translated to Earth years, that would be about 96 years. Wow, he mumbled to himself, and reached for his forehead in a moment of restrained shock. The old geezer had been councilman almost 4 times as long as he had been alive, and for quite some years before they had even made contact with humanity.
Well, we can't all still be calves.
The matriarch commented. I looked over at James as well as her own niece, who James now noticed seemed also a little surprised by the old man's turn of service. Usually James would have and probably should have taken insult to a comment like that. He was a grown-ass man after all. However, seeing that the human lifespan didn't seem to be all that in the galactic context, it could muster the offence. Apparently being the first one to notice that James was in a bit of a predicament at the moment, Captain Uton hurried over to his side and quickly changed the topic.
Come to think of it, this next one coming up will be the first for humanity, right? The last one was still too close to first contact after all. Maybe that will shake things up,
he said, while patting James on the back. They certainly have the numbers to do so. The councilman Corte now inserted himself into the conversation, fixating James with his wet, black eyes. And given how detached they have acted so far, it is hard to predict what direction things may take.
Indeed.
Gashalengas agreed with his contemporary.
In the future, humanity may be one of the most important species to agree with you if you want to hold a seat in the council. Quite exciting, don't you think? And I wouldn't be surprised if soon all future councils included at least one human, if not more. If you wanted to, you might be able to join our ranks pretty soon, James.
James listened up at that. Flattering, but I think you may be exaggerating a bit, he said, and tried his best to appear coy at the suggestion. Humanity may be numerous, but enough to swing an entire election? Numerous is putting it lightly, Corte commented offhandedly, and appeared not at all amused about James playing the airhead.
Wait, just how numerous are you talking?
Ajifionora asked surprisingly and looked down at James, who she apparently had not taken quite so seriously up until now. James awkwardly scratched his neck and looked off into empty space as he answered. Well, 20 billion-ish.
I have a drinking game for this game. Every time James scratches his head, take a shot and see how long before you're unconscious.
In our home system, that is. I don't really know much about the numbers in our outer colonies. The young woman looked down at him with a gaze of pure disbelief. Wait, did you say 20 billion? Reprieve suddenly barged in, and his face had turned from his usual disparagement to a quite perturbed expression. You are telling me your home system alone could balance out those of 20 other species? The flabbergasted look in his eyes was priceless, found James, but he tried to say more professional than that. Maybe. It depends on the species, I guess, he answered nonchalantly, although he had to admit that did put things into perspective for him. He had only ever known the human population to be quite large compared to other species, but thanks to Reprieve's helpful outburst, he now had a point of reference for how large populations were supposed to be.
You are right, of course. While that is an impressive number, it alone is still not enough to decide an entire election necessarily.
The matriarch rejoined the conversation, and James tried to discreetly take a few steps away from her as she came closer.
However, do not underestimate the influence the human vote could have on the other member species.
Her constantly fluttering ears seemed to speed up even further as she said that, making her shadow dance wildly in front of James's feet. I'm not sure I understand, he answered, looking up to the Colossus nervously and straining his eyes to focus on her face. The many eyes of the Leader Supreme narrowed down on him, and he wondered how well she was actually able to see him from all the way up there.
You may not be Corwallers, but you are still primates,
she explained slowly and sounded almost amused.
People will look towards your people for reassurance, and if such a massive and esteemed people start to move into a direction, many others will surely follow. Just look at us. We had our positions for many years because our people trust us, and the community trusts our people.
There they were again, the esteemed primates. And given what he had just heard, The esteemed Proboscis and the esteemed Testudinas could apparently join the club. You think so? James answered thoughtfully, and brought a hand up to his chin as he considered it. At least it certainly made some sense why he was invited here, and with such important company in that. Although some questions were still left unanswered.
I am sure of it.
The matriarch replied with a wide movement of her trunk. Then she lifted her head up high and added more loudly,
But we've been here long enough now. It's time for us to continue. We don't want to be late for our meal, after all.
This time, James's brain had been given something to chew on while they walked through the colourful streets of the station, surrounded by all kinds of different cultures clashing and mixing with each other in the different store and house fronts. There was hardly a place one could look without seeing something that seemed strange and alien in at least one aspect, be it weird architecture, a displeasing colour scheme, or unfamiliar utilities. Combining that with the abnormally huge size of everything, it was easy to get overwhelmed. Over their heads, a constant stream of people was busily walking along the elevated site-specific walkways, which they didn't use due to their wildly differing sizes. Even further above them, the suspension railways were constantly going back and forth between different stations, the rails forming a sort of mesh separating the station's ground and sea. Their next goals weren't quite as exciting as the Great Community Palace had been. Mostly different embassies or outposts, wedged in between storefronts or small communities of people from their worlds. Most were pretty unassuming and showed little in the way of what culture they represented, the houses and stores around them being better indicators of the way of life they brought to the station. The Gorestish, for example, had no doors in sight, apparently living completely open and disclosed to everyone. The Cyprus-Lay, which had turned out to be Reprieve's people from the Death World Tashard, on the other hand, lived very much isolated from the ship, apparently enjoying individual, small, tight, easily maintained rooms as their domain of choice. James was slightly confused as to why exactly he was shown these places, but was never asked to enter and talk to any of the other ambassadors. To him, it seemed a little counterintuitive. He also wondered why he wasn't shown any interesting facilities, like maybe water preparation, or any agricultural areas maybe, or even something like the oxygen production. That would be interesting to see. The whole time, he instead felt like he was basically being groomed, with the matriarch and councillor Kashlenkas constantly trying to talk him up in a multitude of strange and unfitting ways, while looking at symbols of diplomacy, just without the practical part. Right now, the honest-seeming naivety of Afinia Nora and the quite obvious distrustfulness of Reprieve and Acorte were somehow reassuring in comparison. After he had gotten mere glimpses into what the galaxy had to offer, it seemed that they were already done with their little tour. Wordlessly, they followed Madame Tour towards the very side of the station, where just about the biggest wall James had ever seen towered all the way up to the ceiling. He looked along its blank metal surface and noticed that they were heading towards the only place far and wide that seemed to have an identifying feature. To him, it looked like a poorly hidden entrance, to the point where maybe it wasn't supposed to be hidden at all. Number pads were placed alongside the wall at multiple different heights, seemingly randomly, if one didn't notice the fine lines running along the wall just beside them, which clearly belonged to a door. Who knew? Maybe it was just a minimalism thing. It was only supposed to be subtle. He made sure to get a good look at the code the matriarch was inputting into the pad. 53719. He immediately started repeating the numbers in his head, as he watched the door first slide back a small bit, and then out of the way, disappearing behind the rest of the wall.
Surely you remember that I promised to take you behind the scenes, so to speak,
the matriarch said, while turning towards James and giving him an almost cheery look. James wasn't all that impressed yet, but he played along and interestingly looked into the brightly lit hall in front of them. After the entire group had been ushered in, the hidden door closed behind them again. The room they walked into was smaller than most of the places they'd been to today, and looked almost sterile, the clean, white walls reminding James of a hospital. However, going forward a bit, it opened up into a slightly larger tunnel, running along in both directions, a rail running right through its middle. A thick red line on the ground apparently marked the danger zone, and showed that it would probably not be wise to enter the tunnel on foot. James looked up towards the side expectantly. The matriarch was already busy pressing a conveniently placed button on the wall, after which he seemingly waited for a moment.
In a station of this size, it is sometimes necessary for the right people to get from point A to point B in a timely fashion,
she said, looking down at him. She waved him over, and James quickly noted that everyone else was already gathering up in single file right before the red line.
People like us can't always rely on the usual means of transportation around here.
A soft breeze stricken across his face indicated that something big was moving through the tunnel from his left. and he interestedly walked past a line of people and leaned slightly into the danger zone to see what was coming. Almost immediately, he felt himself be pulled back by his jacket as an agitated Reprieve asked him, "What are you doing? Stay back for goodness sake." With an annoyed grunt, James pushed the man off of him and leaned forward again as bright lights were coming closer through the tunnel. The wind blowing against him got stronger, and he had to narrow his eyes while looking in its direction. Already he could hear whatever was coming start to slow down, the brakes loudly screeching. The massive thing needed to lose its velocity before arriving at their stop. Having slowed down to nearly a walking pace, it finally emerged from the tunnel and stopped right where the line of people waiting to enter had formed. It was a huge, sleek, tube-like train lacking any windows. It glided along the single rail as if it was levitating, which it probably was now that James thought about it. The surface was polished to the point that James could faintly make out his reflection on the canvas white material, as next to him, a door loudly started to open. Of course, just as with a very expensive car, the door opened up, as if he needed any more indication that this thing was pure opulence. Treating this as an everyday experience, everyone quickly entered the comparatively small cabin. Of course, you could have probably transported hundreds of humans with this. However, with two Zodatios on board, it became clear that this was supposed to be a bit more of an intimate experience. The inside of the tube was basically equipped like a limousine, just without the seats. Fridges and other comfort articles were lined along the walls, and many of the people around him were quick to help themselves to various drinks and small snacks, while the matriarchs seemingly related their destination to the driver of the high-speed train. Seeing that everyone seemed distracted for the moment, James decided to pull out of the group for a moment, positioning himself into a far-off corner to gather his thoughts. He made some headway playing nice this whole time, but it was exhausting being surrounded by people he didn't enjoy the company of. And while he had gathered hints as to what was going on around him, it was nowhere near enough yet, which meant he would have to go more into the offensive at the dinner table. Maybe the intimacy of the situation would at least make him talkative. He felt the train coming into motion below his feet, so he closed his eyes and leaned against the wall so he wouldn't have to fight against the inertia. "A bit overwhelming, huh?" A soft, low voice said, slowly approaching him. "Was it like this for you?" James asked the captain without opening his eyes again.
"If you believe it was worse,"
The captain laughed, and James could hear the large man sit down in front of him.
"We're handling this pretty well. I take it you have experience with big leagues."
James laughed softly. "Like you wouldn't believe," he retorted sarcastically, and stretched his neck left and right until a satisfying crack sounded from his vertebrae. Hearing the other members of their little party still standing a bit away from him, James took his guard down ever so slightly while talking to the captain alone. "I'm afraid I can't really give you all what you want from me if I don't find out what it is," he said, finally looking over towards the fellow primate. Uton took a deep breath and curled his thin lips into a smile.
"I guess you're right,"
the large man said, and pecked at some strands of the fur around his neck with his right hand.
"But you shouldn't worry about that."
"Easier said than done," James replied. I looked away from the captain and at the wall for a moment. I'm a Death Warder, remember? Worrying is in my blood. As always, when he casually brought up his classification, he was rewarded with a strange look, expressing a modicum of concern, even if this wasn't news to the captain in the slightest.
"Well, right now you are mostly a primate, so even if it seems hard, try to take things with a bit of humor, won't you?"
Udon said encouragingly, and reached out to put a large hand on James's shoulder. James looked back at the captain, then over at the rest of their group, and then back to the captain. Taking a deep breath, he remembered the first time the captain brought this up, back when his arm was being stitched up by Thither. Back when he probably should have realized the weight of being a primate, even, or maybe especially, as a Death Warder. "Say, Paramore," James
What?
said,
You wanna go out?
honoring his previous agreement to let Tidus be Tidus for now. Even though I've heard it before, I never thought...
Hmm? Do you want some wet food? Alright, let's go get you some wet food. Alright, let's go get your can open. Go open a can of food. I had leftover craft dinner.
Not much of it, but now I do have to wonder, what is supposed to be so special about us primates? Uthor looked surprised at this question, but apparently James's gaze was earnest enough to not make him question it. The large man loudly breathed out with pursed lips and reached for his head, rubbing across it while thinking. Oh, well, where do I start with that? He said ruminatively, and crossed his arms in front of his chest while looking up at the ceiling. Since the dawn of the galactic community, us primates have been renowned for our quick wits and supposedly exceptional curiosity, with the intelligence to back them up. I can't tell you exactly how it started, but I think it must have been like this since my people helped found the community itself. Along the many species that joined since then, it is not quite so fitting anymore to call all primates smarter than any other order. But the belief stuck around, even new members picked it up over time. I couldn't tell you why. You'll probably have to ask a historian to find out more about that. And just some stupid old belief has this much impact? James asked, more himself than the captain, as he thought back to the times of rules seemingly being bent around in places. There has to be more to it. The captain looked at him worriedly as James got lost in thought, wherever the screeching of brakes and the pull of inertia on their bodies informed the two of them that they were quickly nearing their destination.
Only $8.99 for this washing machine. Small body, but big power.
James looked across the giant table in front of him. An enormous tablecloth covered it, as an immaculate plain of pure white, laying there like an undisturbed layer of fresh snow. A laughably high chair, worthy of a diving board, had been brought for him so he could even reach up to the colossal plate of the Leader Supreme's dinner table. It was the first time in a long while that he was sitting in the chair to eat, yet it brought him no comfort. Apparently this high society meeting considered itself too good to have people sitting on the table, like it was custom in the entire rest of the galactic community. The room did its best to reinforce that notion, as there was no sign of the blank walls of cold metal so characteristic for any spacebound vessel anywhere. Every square centimetre of the room was clad in some form of dark wood or colourful cloth, giving the spacious room an elegant yet almost antiquated feeling. Of course, just as was the case with the Matriarch's office building, the red carpet was not missing here either. The same was the case with various statues, although these examples seemed to show actual works of art instead of pompous depictions of core welders. The decoration also continued onto the tables, as huge, elaborately woven cubes made thick, rattan-like material adorned each table. Some held vases or pots with flowers within them, others candle holders. Apparently no decoration could go without a woven container. As his eyes wandered across the table once more, they inevitably landed right in front of him. The shiningly polished cutlery that had already been placed for him when he arrived was different from the ones he was used on Earth. It consisted only of a fork and a spoon. The fork was long and thin, with only two tiny prongs at the end, and reminded him of a fondue fork, while the spoon also had a long handle, but ended in a deepened, very rounded head, like that of a portioning spoon. Looking slightly to the right of him, to the only other person sitting on a mountain of a chair like he was, he had a pretty good idea whose trunk-covered mouth these instruments were made for originally. Looking a lot like James felt, Raprik didn't seem all too comfortable while sitting at a table with the galaxy's elite. That or he was just afraid of heights. The small man was constantly licking his trunk and also had trouble holding his hand still, while he constantly surveyed the room for any threat his nervous mind could conjure up. The rest of their company emanated a more relaxed aura, although even their done-it-all demeanour was intermittently disrupted by side glances or an unusual movement of their face. The more normally sized people at the table all sat on more sensibly looking chairs, although they still looked a bit awkward next to the sheer size of the Zodathios-sized table. Of course, some adaptations in each chair's design have been necessary to accommodate for the different body forms, which is why they were usually scrapped in the community at large in the first place. While the captain's seat looked a lot like a chair James would know from Earth, if a bit large and misshapen, the seat of the chair of Councilman Kashalengas had to be positioned at an angle for him to be able to comfortably position his shell and tail. And what Councilman Akorte was sitting on could hardly even be called a chair. It was more of a couchette he could lie on with his entire body, his limbs hanging off the sides, and at least two of his hands positioned towards the table. Lastly, James's eyes slowly rose up, looking at the person right across from him. Even the matriarch only reached over the massive table from her long neck upwards, while half kneeling, half lying next to it. With her head now being a lot closer to James's level, his colossal size got a lot clearer. That was especially true for her four tusks, each of which dwarfed James as they hovered only slightly above the table's plate. The only one coming even close to rivaling her sheer presence was, of course, her niece, sitting right next to the matriarch, but from this new elevated position, the size difference between even the two titans was noticeable. Ajifeonora still had some growing to do if she wanted to fill the metaphorical shoes of her aunt. All things considered, James felt like a puppet, placed on the kitchen table to participate in the meal by an imaginative child. The clean and, for a space station, remarkably fresh air in the spotless room had a strange heaviness to it, and he longingly thought back to the smoky air, awful music, and cold, hard table of Gouviat Shea. And even more than that, he longed for the company of that night. Even the rowdy Tonamstrasite would make for a welcome guest right now. He honestly wondered if one of the many Tonamstrasite ambassadors he knew from the news networks had ever been, or even would ever be invited to this very table. Somehow he doubted it, even though he had to admit that that might have been his personal bias against his host speaking.
I hope you do not mind the moment of wait.
The matriarch's voice suddenly broke the silence, as she waved her trunk across the table, making James jerk upright. He had sunk down a bit as he got lost in thought.
I wanted to ensure that you get your first taste of our local delicacies in their freshness and most delectable form.
Putting on his best toothless smile, while the shiver crept across his back, James waved off the concerns of the matriarch. I don't mind at all, he said, in a calm manner, and gesticulated with his right hand, mimicking Madame Tour's trunk movement to the best of his ability. Among humans, patience is a virtue, and all good things need their time. It wasn't a lie. James didn't really mind the wait. What he did mind a lot more was that the matriarch had committed her second party foul of their meeting, and she had apparently chosen what he would be eating for him before they had even arrived. On Earth, even the worst service would give you at least two options to choose from. For a moment he wondered if it was possible that she had done so in order to prevent him from ordering anything containing meat and ruining her appetite. This in turn made him wonder what the menu of a place like this would even look like. Did they even serve meat around here? His eyes fell on the Councilman Akorte for a moment. His species was clearly what James would identify as an amphibian, and on Earth amphibians were, with the exception of some tadpoles, exclusively carnivorous. Although by now he should probably have learned that, while humans usually use their Earth terms as translation for the strange, purely phenotypical ordering the galaxy at large was using to categorize its species, that wasn't always the most accurate, and every now and then led to some wrong assumptions. After all, on Earth, the primate species that at least semi-regularly consume meat outnumbered the completely vegan ones, while such a thing was unheard of in the rest of the galaxy. A fine thing to hear, that even people with such short lives know how important it is to take their time, Korojish mused, rubbing the loose, leathery skin of his neck with two of his long claws. That earned him a disapproving look of Ajifeonora, who was sitting to his left. Apparently she was the only one around seeing the poorly veiled problem in confronting someone with a statement such as that one. From the opposite side of the table, Councilman Acorte now also spoke up. Beginning from their very youth, his people spent an enormous portion of their time focusing nothing but learning. With only as much as 1 standard year of age, most of them have already finished more than half of their basic education. It is safe to say that humans have learned to use the time given to them effectively. He explained to his cohort. Somebody had done his homework. And very different from his previous behavior, his tone sounded almost reverent. Or maybe it was more warning. But the old reptile just chuckled his croaking chuckle, and almost nostalgically replied, "Quite exemplary. Truly a shining example of primate kind, those humans." "Quite!" Captain Uchon agreed with the councilman, and threw an encouraging look over towards James. Although James awkwardly smiled back at the large man, the remark had missed its mark. And not only James had a hard time going along with the narrative the people at the table were creating around humans. Rapri just could not help himself but make a depreciatory sound, something James could very much sympathize with right now, even if his reasons were most likely different. He had no problem imagining the shining example of primate kind not quite matching up with the picture Rapri had developed of humanity after witnessing James's exploits firsthand. The talk was interrupted by the door to the kitchen opening, and waiters stepping out to deliver their dinner. The portions for the matriarch and her niece were so enormous that only another Zoditos could effectively carry them, and they were served in nearly swimming pool-sized bowls, or maybe buckets was better fitting as a description of the deep containers, allowing James no insight into what they had ordered for themselves. The other trays and plates were brought by a variety of Corwalder waiters, as they were for most part too small to be sensibly carried by one of the Titans. The service personnel used the same half-stairs, half-ladders that the attendees had used to get on top of their chairs before to deliver their food. Among the dishes, James noticed an abundance of meaty, legume-like fruits, making up many of the main courses. He figured this was where the vegan species of many players got the proteins necessary for their big brains from. His own dish, brought by a nervous-looking young member of the same species as the guard who had so clumsily mishandled the pepper spray during the security training exercise, also consisted mainly of thick, oily, bean-like fruits, prepared along with a variety of root vegetables.
3, 4.
He really hoped the dish was more appetizing than it looked. While he usually didn't spurn a vegan meal option, he also had to admit to himself that he was a bit childish when it came to the prospect of eating exclusively vegetables. Bon appetit, James mumbled, after he had thanked the waiter and was ready to at least start to eat out of courtesy. He didn't wait for an answer, as people were already starting to eat all around him, and carefully scooped the dark things with the strange long fork. Taking the first bite, it didn't taste bad. It was pretty fatty and hearty, and luckily not as flavourless as he would have expected from a giant bean. Although he didn't enjoy the mealy consistency it turned to after he chewed it for a bit at all. Maybe he was a bit spoiled when it came to food.
"I do hope it meets your taste."
Madame Tuer commented across the table between mouths full of some sort of thick leaf she shoveled into her mouth, with what was basically an oversized pitchfork. "If that is the case, you should have let me make my own order," James thought pertly to himself, although he managed to keep up a more agreeable facade outwardly. "I have certainly had worse," he answered, not wanting to appear too flattering, especially since he wasn't sure if he could hide his unhappy expression with each bite he took. Keeping in line with his straightforward approach to things, Councilman Acorte now directly addressed James, lifting his head slightly off his cachet to look directly at him. "I wonder, say, could your people survive in a diet like this?" he asked, his voice remaining in a very matter-of-fact tone. "It is quite a bit different from what you would usually consume on your homeworld, after all." He left the obvious implications of his question quite vague, and James wondered if that was out of discretion or appreciation. James took time with chewing and swallowing a bite of food before he answered, raising one finger towards the councilman to indicate for him to wait. After also taking a sip of water to release his throat, James finally replied, "Most likely we could. There are already people on Earth living with an entirely vegan diet, and fruits like these are most likely a welcome diversification for them." The face of Acorte seemed to relax from a tension James had not noticed was there once he heard that. "I had expected as much, but finding confirmation for it proved to be difficult," he said, and his tone also slightly relaxed. "Many sources in your network were shown to be quite contradictory on the topic." "I can imagine," James replied awkwardly, and put down his fork for a moment while talking, not too unhappy to have an excuse to not continue eating for a bit. It is still a very subject for many humans, and everyone wants their own pre-built opinion to be the right one, so they either demonize the vegan diet or praise it into all heavens. Fact is, with today's technology, it neither has a detrimental nor a beneficial effect on our health. It is simply a lifestyle decision.
Not surprising.
Councilman Kashalangas commented in a strangely satisfied tone.
There are primates, after all. This only goes to show, no matter the circumstances, an honourable life will never be more than 2 claws worth of digging away from them.
The people surrounding him noticed quickly that his choice of words had been a poor one, as the mood of the room shifted, as some aghast and disapproving glances were thrown at the old man. And this time even James could not and did not want to remain silent on the matter. Changing his tone to a rather unhappy one for the first time during the meeting, and combining it with an admittedly rather predatory look towards the reptile, James responded, "I would highly prefer it if you did not label the way my people and many others live naturally as dishonourable, Councilman." The old man's mouth stood open for a moment as he wordlessly looked back at James with a strange, unreadable expression. Quickly, the matriarch intervened, seemingly rushing to the councilman's aid.
I am sure he did not mean to insult you, James.
She said conciliatorily and waved her trunk trying to calm him, which had the exact opposite of the intended effect. As much as he wanted to, he couldn't muster the courage to directly approach the
What
matriarch.
we're dealing with here.
The heavy leftover feeling of fear in the back of his mind rearing his ugly head. However, help arrived from an unlikely source, as someone unexpected backed him in his outrage.
Well, he did it anyway.
Ajay Fionora spoke up, looking at her aunt sternly. We shouldn't let a councilman get away with stuff like that so easily. They were supposed to be better than that. Maybe he had judged the girl prematurely, James thought. There seemed to be the spark of a leader within her. Clearly surprised that someone would directly step up to her like that, Madame Tua looked at her niece in disregard. However, she soon noticed all eyes around the table being glued to their exchange, especially the distrustful gaze of James. Her expression quickly changed as she turned towards her niece, again taking up her conciliatory tone.
Of course, you are right, dear,
she said, and James could clearly pick up on the disgruntled undertone beneath her sweet demeanour. She turned her attention towards the councilman, who observed the whole situation seemingly quite lost.
Kashalangas, you should know better than to slip up like that. You should apologize to James. I'm sure he will forgive you this time if you do.
Her choice of words left something to be desired, James. The snarling tone in her voice seemed a bit misdirected as well, putting emphasis on all the wrong things in that sentence. Either way, the old man looked back and forth between the matriarch and James with a lost expression for some time.
I'm sorry,
he finally said, with his eyes centered on James for some time. His voice was crackly and sounded quite unsure, almost confused as he spoke, making the apology sound sincere on one hand, but misguided on the other.
I never imagined you would take offense to that.
It was James's turn now. Diplomatically speaking, it would be best to let this one mess up slide. Accept the excuse and let bygones be bygones. However, James's more spiteful side heavily protested that idea despite his better judgment. Only when the captain sitting to his left woke up was James slowly pulled out of his hesitation.
Forgive the old James, but do me that favour, please.
The large primate said sincerely.
I can vouch for the fact that he would never willingly offend you.
Apparently there was quite a bit of cognitive dissonance between James and the other attendees here. His problem had very little to do with the old man's intent, and a lot to do with the very basis of his statement. However, raising a huge stink about it right here, right now, would probably help no one, as much as he disliked it. Alright, I'll cave, he said with a sigh, relaxing his posture and expression. But only because it's you, Captain.
Thank you, James,
Captain Uton said, in the most relieved tone James had ever heard out of him.
I'm sure it won't happen again.
James waited off as he returned his attention forward again. Making sure she was looking at him, he gave Ajay Fionora an acknowledging nod, thanking her for having his back. The tiding was hard to read, but he felt like he had gotten the message across. Out of the corner of his eye, he noticed that Kashalangas may have looked relieved about his forgiveness as well. However, he still seemed no less lost about the situation, even after it was resolved. He stared down at his leg, his eyes as he seemed to look at either trying to solve the situation or simply wanting to get everything he wanted to say out before it was too late. It was Councilman Acorte who picked up the conversation back up. Well, from what I have read, she was a quite flexible being when it comes to individuals, he stated. And James wondered just how much he had read about humanity. Then again, as a councilman, it wasn't too strange that he would be interested in such a massive addition to the community. I'm sure they will adapt to the circumstances surrounding them in the community in no time. That much was true.
That would.
When push came to shove,
Maybe.
humans would make do. Although changing the humans' habits was probably quite a bit harder than Accorte imagined, based on just the raw data. And a sideways glance from Reprieve showed that he was not the only one having that thought. If he was honest, he was quite surprised how well the warrant officer seemed to get humanity by now, at least if his interpretation of the man's reactions was accurate. Then again, that was possibly part of his job.
It may still take some time to release this status quo sinks in. There are quite
Madame Turner joined the conversation, putting on her sickly sweetest tone as she talked and raising her trunk to sway its halves, accompanying her speech.
However, I see it just as you, Accorte. Once humanity spreads out into the community at large, they'll surely become a marvelous member species.
At this time, James was getting sick of flattering, especially since it all seemed so strangely underhanded to him. Then again, would anything politicians said while executing their duty not seem underhanded? Still, what he said did make him think. The general status quo. What was that? Distrust of other Death World people? Or at least Death World predators? Along with an ingrained respect for the revered orders, the aversion of cybernetics was definitely part of it as well. And possibly also nudism? Was that a step too far? Maybe vacuum phobia? Then again, that could be more nature than nurture. Also apparently a preference for a vegan diet. Even with humanity adapting, he didn't see most of those happening within big parts of it. This also made him wonder how many of these things were around in other species before they joined the community. He can imagine that the culture of member species would over time change and adapt to more closely resemble that of the general community. But just how much? What about people that didn't adapt as well as others? There were some laws members had to follow as part of the community. However, none of those encompassed any of the mentioned things. Well, except for maybe unity in the community, he mumbled to himself, for a moment forgetting the situation he was in his thoughtfulness.
Quite right.
Captain Warren responded happily, apparently well misinterpreting James's mind.
It may be a bit of a rocky start for humanity given your circumstances, but you'll have that figured out in no time, and then you'll be heading straight towards prime membership in the galactic community.
Prime membership, status quo, adaption, unity. All of these words buzzed around in James's head for a while as he sat there. He quickly picked his fork back up and started eating the now significantly cooler meal in front of him, using it as an excuse to not reply for a bit. He was no stranger to the ultimate of unity. It was even one of the three virtues his home proclaimed in its national anthem. However, there it went along with and was balanced by rights and freedom, a balance that he felt to be quite important in one way or the other, and something that was missing in the community's motto. Then again, how much weight could he actually put on something like an inspirational little motto that seemed to be rarely even used? Maybe he was being a bit paranoid here. It wouldn't have been the first time. However, if he followed this train of thought, some things he had witnessed suddenly began to make a whole lot more sense. He decided to put things at least slightly to the test. Well, I don't know. So far I mostly seem to freak people out, he replied, and put a bit of emphasis on the word freak, just enough to be the slightest bit noticeable. While doing so, he threw a challenging look over to Reprieve, who had remained in the background so far. Reprieve twitched for a moment when he realized he was being addressed. However, he quickly let out a long breath and regained his composure. Well, your behavior can be a bit off, but it is nothing that couldn't be worked out, the warrant officer admitted hesitantly, carefully picking his words since James and him had only ever officially met thrice, and only very briefly. And as far as Reprieve knew, those were the only times James could be thinking about now. However, James also noticed the man throwing glances towards the major as he carefully picked his words, although your particular choice of company certainly doesn't help with that. James was a bit surprised that he would say it so bluntly, but it wasn't untrue. The demeanor of people surrounding him changed drastically depending on the company he was in. By now he suspected it depended on whether the people he was with more evoked his primate or his Death Order image with their presence.
Right, you've grown quite fond of Uton's protege, haven't you?
Madame Tua commented in a strange tone James couldn't quite place.
What was her name again?
Petty Officer First Class Sheeda, James quickly answered, making sure to use her full title for a change. And yes, she and I are quite close. A bit of an understatement, but he decided to leave it at that. Around here, it wasn't really anybody's business.
Oh,
Maybe
motherfucker.
Captain's, but he could talk to him in private later. Next to him, he could hear Uton clear his throat, and out of the corner of his vision, he saw the large man nervously scoot around in his seat. Rumor among your shipmates has it that you have been quite successfully taking her down, Councilman Accorte said, joining the conversation once again. His many eyes focused on James as his body heavily rose up and settled down with each breath he took while laying down. Accorte realized quicker than his contemporary before him that he had chosen his words poorly, and he quickly corrected himself, adding, "What I mean is that she has gotten quite a bit more sociable since she joined the crew, of course. I hear she was a bit of a rascal before." "A respectable save," found James. Eugenie seemed to like Accorte in a positive way. He at least seemed to be very upfront with his intentions when compared to the other people present here. James brought a hand to his chin as he answered, "I guess you could say that." In reality, Sheeta hasn't changed all that much since he had come around. He had just presented an opportunity for her to talk to people without them instantly trying to avoid her, and maybe gotten her to be a little less spiteful in places. The people who had really gotten more sociable were those who he had almost forced to actually interact with her.
I assure you, Sheeta is not bad company.
Captain Uton chimed in, nervously fidgeting with his hands. What had got him so riled up?
She is a dutiful member of my crew and a hard worker, and she has made the best of her circumstances.
A bit of an awkward silence broke out, during which most eyes were directed at Uton. Most notable were a very confused look from Aja Fionora, who was presumably the only person with no idea who they were talking about, as well as another puzzling look from her aunt. Surprisingly, Uton's nervousness also had the effect of pulling Councilman Kashlangas out of his own thoughts. The old man turned towards his longtime friend and made some encouraging gestures towards him. Thinking that enough was enough, James decided to have his boss's back for a change as well. There, Captain," he said, putting on a very deliberate casual tone. "I'm sure no one here was suggesting anything in that direction, right?" Just as deliberately, he turned towards Rapri, bringing the burden of the conversation back to the warrant officer, who had so carelessly brought up James's friends. Their company seemed to interestingly eye the interaction between the two Death Warders, as James had engaged the Superslung directly for the second time now. Rapri quickly combed through the fur in his face with his hands a few times, avoiding James's gaze as he stared him down. "She's not unsalvageable," he finally admitted, still not returning James's gaze, while his trunk wildly moved as he talked.
She is effective in her line of duty.
Feeling pretty validated, James smiled at the critter and nodded, turning towards the captain, planning to swap some encouraging words with his fellow primate. However, the warrant officer wasn't quite done yet, and just couldn't help himself and mumbled something under his breath.
Even so, that still leaves the...
he murmured into his trunk. Not intending on just letting him finish that sentence, James immediately shot back around to him, and this time Rapri wasn't fast enough in looking away, his eyes meeting James with a surprised stare. "The what?" James said, overly friendly, and slightly exposed his teeth in a faint grin as he spoke. "I didn't catch that. Could you speak up?" Rapri's head jerked backwards as James' intense stare hit him. The cyborg," Rapri stammered a bit louder. Even the more innocent depictions seemed to cause an almost immediate change of mood at the table.
Cyborg?
Aja Fionora asked, this time apparently not satisfied with just sitting there not knowing what was being discussed. James turned towards her, making sure to hide his teeth again, when he gave her a more honest smile. "My friend, Curie," he explained, putting a bit of excitement into his voice. "You should meet them sometime, they're great, although I admit they take some getting used to." It was almost funny, the way the councilman looked at him now. It was as if he had made the girl an immoral offer right there at the dinner table. As most times, the matriarch managed to hide her feelings a bit better, not cracking her sweet facade with an indignant reaction. The girl herself reacted surprisingly candidly, merely stating, "Well, if you say so. Guess they can't be too bad if you think so highly of them," while once again waving both halves of her trunk in a way that James by now started to interpret as a shrug-like gesture for Zodiatos. And apparently he really should have given the girl more credit. Either that, or she was a much better actress than anyone else at the table. Obviously, their remaining company operated under the rule of, if you have nothing nice to say nothing at all at that moment. The saying could just leave it be with that statement.
Hello.
Presumably, they were very much
Look at the
interested in not
twinkers.
upsetting James any further than he had apparently already been. This started the second bout of awkward silence at the table, as most of the attendees seemed to struggle to find a suitable topic to pick the conversation back up. The one finally succeeding was Captain Uton, who seemed to be calmed himself in the meantime, seeing as the topic of his protege was now over. Stroking his fur smooth with his big hands, the large man said,
Yes, but those aren't the only friends James has made on board. In fact, you'd be hard-pressed to find someone who doesn't, at the very least, get along with him.
"Well, that someone is sitting right here at the table with us," James thought to himself, and cracked a smile at his snide remark that only he could hear.
I wonder, is it the same among your people?
Madame Tour thought out loud and focused on James, giving him goosebumps. At this point, he wasn't even sure if it was out of fear or just the sheer intensity of her gaze.
Are you a people person, or are just humans just naturally good at making friends?
James chuckled awkwardly and rubbed the back of his head.
Take a shot.
I never had any trouble getting along with people, although I can't really say I'm a people person.
Every time he says rubs the back of his head or scratches his head, take a shot.
Well, usually that was. This whole interaction was everything but easy.
Nothing that can't be learned,
Koshlenka said, speaking up for the first time again after a long bit of silence.
A few tweaks here and there, and they'll be eating right out of your hand.
The old man chuckled to himself, making his long neck sway around in his amusement. James looked at him confusedly. I don't think that'll be necessary, he replied, raising a single eyebrow at the reptilian. I'm a scientist, not a politician. I like to convince with facts and results, not with fancy words. No offense.
None taken,
Akute dryly replied from the other side of the table, sounding almost like he agreed with James.
Of course, of course,
Koshlenkas continued, and conciliatorily raised an arm to wave off James's inquiry.
I was only speaking in hypotheticals. Forgive an old man. Sometimes my mouth is faster than my mind.
Well, it was much easier to forgive him for this than for his other comment.
But you do have to admit, you are in quite the unique position, James,
Valentua said, and gesticulated with her laughably big piece of cutlery in one half of her trunk.
You have lived in the community for a good while now. You have come into deeper contact with it than presumably any other one of your kind. Won't your people be interested in what you, as some with direct experience, has to say? Will they want you to guide them onto a good path towards a smooth integration into the community, as someone who is walking it himself?
James always laughed at that. With all due respect, ma'am, he responded, and looked right into the matriarch's monstrous eyes. I doubt many people will give a damn about what I have to say. For most of them, life hasn't changed much since we joined the community, and due to Earth being Earth, it probably won't change much in the future either. Sure, they see off-roaders in the media every now and then, and there may be some new training done, but all in all, most of them will still go to work the same way, they will still go home the same way, and overall, they will live the same way. For most humans, it doesn't matter too much what is going on in the great picture, since only very little of that trickles all the way down to them. And for the people at the top, who do care about stuff like that, I am just some random scientist. I don't have what it takes to make those people listen to me. They will have their own idea about integration and follow that, which is probably a good idea, since they know a lot more about stuff like this than I do. It was probably the most honest thing he had said all night.
So what you are saying is, people would need a reason to listen to you.
The Supreme summarized, apparently coming to a very different conclusion than James about what his little speech was meant to convey. He also did absolutely not like her undertone. However, said undertone vanished when she seemingly snapped right back into her sugary demeanor and quickly asked,
Tell me, James, even if they don't listen, what would you be telling humanity about the galactic community should the topic ever come up?
James, who could at this point only assume that this meeting was a way to get him involved in their electoral campaign somehow, replied carefully. Well, it's a bit odd and rough around the edges, and there are some things in place that just don't agree with us humans. But all in all, it's got its heart in the right place. And if we are willing to put some work into it, I'm sure we'll find a way to smooth things out in time. Captain Utom laughingly answered to that, raising his glass. Quite a bit of the table joined in with him, also raising their glasses and echoing back at him. Hear, hear. James could feel himself turn red and lowered his head. Maybe he shouldn't have gotten so philosophical. This toast basically marked the end of their dinner, and while he had not gotten much out of them, his worries had at least been slightly eased. They were politicians close to a big election, so it seemed they were merely out to try and gain every advantage they could, with a large new group of voters. Although this nagging feeling about his theories regarding the community's unity was still eating away at the back of his mind. They finished their meals, and since it was a business meeting, first and foremost, they did not bother with many niceties afterwards, leaving the table in a timely fashion. The entire group escorted him outside, and while they walked, clear signs of fatigue started to show on many of them. Only himself and Rapri seemed to be just as fit as when they had started today's guided tour. The Zodaitos seemed to at least somewhat keep it together, but everyone else appeared to be just about ready to collapse into bed. Therefore, goodbyes were held to a minimum, everyone only giving brief parting words to each other. When it came to saying goodbye to Ajifianora, James overcame himself for a moment, reaching out his hand towards her. She had more than proven that she deserved this, so he clenched his teeth and smiled at her, and she reached her massive trunk down towards him. The contact was brief, It was still enough to make him feel like he was about to break out in cold sweats, but somehow it was a further warning.
Great things are ahead of us, I know it.
Was what Kashalenga said once James turned to him. Cryptic and strange as everything the old man had directed at him so far, James just awkwardly nodded at that. Maybe 96 years of service was a bit much, even for a long-lived species. Good day, Ambassador, was all the court I had for him, a sentiment that James all too happily returned.
Don't be a stranger.
Captain Luton once again said to him, softly patting his shoulder. Right back at you, James replied. He probably had something to discuss with the captain, and only the captain, anyway.
Well, James, this has been quite the evening. Do not be surprised if I contact you again.
The massive, looming matriarch said, as James had to throw his head all the way back to look up at her. He didn't quite know what to say. Something like, spare me, was the first thing that came to his mind. However, he thought better of it. I will try and keep a spot in my schedule free for you, James replied, trying to sound as businesslike as possible. With the prospect of getting away from her soon, the feeling of dread that he had banished into the far-off corners of his mind was starting to claw its way back, and he could feel himself getting a bit jittery. Then he turned, addressing everyone in their little round. It has been an honor, everyone, he said. And this time there was at least a kernel of truth in that. Success to you. Success to you, it echoed back at him, as he turned to leave. It had not gone past him that Raprig had not yet shown any interest in exchanging parting words with him, and as he started to walk away from the group, familiar footsteps walked after him. Although this time, when he turned around to look at the man, Raprig just stood there, also coming to a halt, as he returned James's gaze. I have a bit of time until my next appointment. Do you mind if I accompany you for a bit of the way? The small man said, cocking his head sideways to more easily look at James. James looked at the rodent distrustfully, but decided, as long as he was worrying his assistant, having or not having Raprig around didn't make all that much of a difference. But he had to wonder why the warrant officer would suddenly want to come along with him. He would only be able to get the answer to that on their way, he figured.
Okay,
Sure,
fine person.
he said, shrugging, and turned around again to continue on his way. But do try to keep up. I shouldn't have to wait for a fellow Death Rider after all.
Another zipper. I wonder if there's something I can do with these pieces. I wonder if I can get like the zipper part and attach it so I can have this as another zipper to use. I don't know if it'd be worth it. Ooh, that's lovely. That is not lovely. Holy shit, what the motherfucker long? How long this bitch is? That's one zipper. Like, look at that.
Start banking with RBC
Like a
and you
freaking
could get a credit card
suitcase
limit of up
zipper.
to
Jesus Christ, there's
$15,000.
another one.
On your period, sudden gushes happen. Say goodbye gush tears,
Nope.
thanks to Always Ultra Thins with rapid dry technology that absorbs 2 times faster. Hello, keep comfortable. Always
Coin
feel
purses, so I
gush.
have to have pretty good slide.
SCP 6659.
Oh god.
Medic-
I'm not interested. I want to hear the rest of them search. That's a nice slide. Okay.
The general travel speed had more than tripled after the two Death Riders split off from the...
There we go.
The general travel speed had more than tripled after the two Death Riders split off from the group, now using the fast lane walkways appropriate for their size. The life on the station went on below them, out of their way, as they briskly marched on. Some of the higher buildings of the station still stuck up into their peripheral vision, along with the other walkways also snaking their way through the open space of the station. So, that was an experience, wasn't it? James asked, after they walked inside. Even though the freak had announced himself following James this time, that didn't stop him from always staying just out of James's sight. Of course, James could still clearly hear his footsteps and breathing just behind him, however an irking feeling of paranoia still urged him to turn around and look at the man every few seconds. He hoped that maybe making conversation would ease that feeling a bit. Repeating made a sort of sniffling sound for a moment, and James imagined the warrant officer looking at the back of his head distrustfully, wriggling his trunk a bit while deciding how to answer that. Well, don't get to meet the people ruling our world every day, he finally replied, almost dismissively. At least he had answered at all. But that did bring up a good point. Now that you mention it, James responded, and threw another look over his shoulder, causing Reprieve to jerk his head sideways to better look back at James. The walls of the station were still slowly crawling past him in their periphery, as James showed no signs of slowing down, despite not looking where he was going anymore. No offense, Reprieve, but why were you there? Warrant Officer is a nice title and all, but not exactly one that gets you invited to a meeting like that one. Or am I wrong there? Reprieve's eyes narrowed at James's inquiry. His fur and trunk shifted with each small hop he made, yet his head and eyes managed to seemingly remain locked on one level as he returned James's gaze. Finally, after a few seconds of staring, he shook his head, making his trunk swing left to right, exaggeratedly. Honestly, I've been asking myself that as well, he said, reaching one hand up to stroke over his trunk, stopping his movement and bringing it back into place. It is similar to your situation. I was invited, so I came. When the Leader Supreme asks for your attendance, there isn't much room for questions. That strangely sounded a lot like the truth, found James. Then again, he probably shouldn't really believe any information that Reprieve willingly surrendered to him. Guess not, James replied thoughtfully. He brought his eyes back forward and looked around. Slowly they were nearing their destination. As using the secret bullet train at the station without explicit permission would be ill-advised, the two would have to settle for the more public mode of transportation presented by the suspension railways. The nearest station being a 20-minute walk away from the location of their dinner, and had already come into view. A wide variety of different occupants at the station, most of them the typical mix of colourful giants of different flavours, was already waiting for the next train to arrive. Almost there, James thought, while looking up at the assembly of commuters.
Motherfucker! Oh!
Something I didn't know, Reprieve replied, apparently thinking that James's statement was directed at him. Water freezes at 0 degrees, but reaches its highest density at 4. James complied to the sarcastic request. I'm sorry, what degrees? Reprieve asked confusedly. Oh, I'm just babbling, James answered, and shook his head, snickering. You're a strange creature, you know that, Reprieve said, putting on an almost resigned tone. You don't know the half of it, James laughed, waving it off. Reprieve didn't seem to find that quite as funny as James did, so he felt quiet for a moment, as James chuckled to himself. But hey, I mean, given where I come from, I think that much is understandable, isn't it? James spoke back up, stopping his laughter and throwing a quick smile over his shoulder. He had expected this one to be a little intense, however, after having spent the entire day with the warrant officer, as well as people a lot more intimidating than him. James felt adventurous around the small man. That almost makes it sound like you were proud of that, he addressed, commented glumly, and his trunk started to move left to right on his own. Well, proud is the wrong word, James replied, putting a bit more of a spring in his step and demonstratively lifting one finger up to his lips as he thought. But I mean, you have to admit, it does bring a certain flow with it. We're both Death Warders here, you can say it. A rustle told James to take his shut at that, or at least something to shake out his fur. Our homes are hardly comparable, Reed said, taking his sleeves and being from Death Warder, or having himself compared to the Freak in any way. James shrugged and brought his hands up behind his head as he casually walked on. Well, I wouldn't know, he said aloofly. What is Tashard like? Reprieve made a sound similar to a displeased grunt, although it sounded more like a squeal out of his mouth. All in all, you're standing for our planet. It has a nice regulated climate, plenty of resources, large vegetation, and a stable environment as well as biodiversity, he listed off. And it didn't get past James that he was clearly trying to show off how not like Earth his home was. However, in a more dismissive but also slightly meek tone, he finally had to add, it just so happens to be a lot larger than your usual core world, causing a deadly strong gravitational pull for many species on its surface. So, a Class 1 then, James thought to himself. Barely a difference from any old, normal world. Taking his musing outside of his head, James once again looked up now, although this time he intended for Reprieve to hear it. So, you're a Death Warder and a Core Warder, he said casually. That means your people probably joined the community fairly early on, doesn't it? Were there already other Death Warders around at that point? Reprieve let out what sounded like a single humorless laugh. It sounded like he turned to look away from James for a moment. Actually, the term was invented for us, he answered, with clearly suppressed emotions. Really? James asked surprisingly, and turned around to look at Reprieve. He had indeed looked away from James for a moment, staring off towards the station's walls in the distance. When the first proto-community alliance was formed between the core worlds back in the day, it was believed that life could only exist under very specific conditions. After all life discovered so far seemed to follow those rules, he explained, almost somberly and without looking at James once. And while the assumption is probably still true in a way, it turned out that those conditions were a bit broader than first believed when the Sipperslang reached the stars, the first species from a planet that would have killed species from other planets had they developed there, and thus the term Death Order was born. It was almost embarrassing that James had never thought about the fact that there must have been a first Death Order at some point. Since humanity had joined the community so late, the concept had just felt like it had always been around. That must have been quite the shock for people on both sides back then, huh? He responded. And not wanting to linger in fear that he would start to stare at Reprieve, he continued to walk instead. It was, but luckily that time is behind us now, Reprieve answered, and the tone of his voice made it clear that the topic was over. For a moment, James seriously considered ignoring that to keep asking more questions, but the answers he sought could just as well go somewhere else. At least Reprieve did not leave him hanging with another bout of uncomfortable silence, as he decided that a change of topic was a better method of making sure it would not be talked about any longer. But enough about me. What I want to know is, are you considering it? He asked, and lowered his voice, his somber tone from before vanishing. Considering what? James responded confusedly, and wondered if he had missed something earlier in the conversation. Well, running for a position in the council, Reprieve clarified, still almost shout-whispering it to James. Although James had no idea why the topic would run such a secretive atmosphere. The election is coming up very soon, so you'd have to make preparations right away. James cracked up at the suggestion, but could just about hold back from outright laughing. Absolutely not, he exclaimed with emphasis, and shook both his head and his hand to make sure he really got the message across. I'm staying out of politics. Besides, wouldn't I have to wait to see if the council is reinstated anyway? Reprieve slightly jolted back at James's outburst and was now hurrying to get back into his old position. Not as long as there's an empty seat, and as luck would have it, that is the case right now, he replied, once he managed to catch back up to James. Think about it, the position of the seat in the council is like no other. You help shape the entirety of the galaxy. And if even the councilmen say so, you have a good chance of actually making it. Doesn't that sound appealing to you at all? James shook his head again, although more subdued than the first time. No, not at all, he responded soberly. I'll leave that to people who understand something of it. I'm sure there are more than enough humans willing to take a place at the helm of the galactic community, waiting in the wings already, but I am not one of them. They had by now reached their get-off point from the walkway, where a network of ramps connected the different
God damn it,
walkways to
stop
the ground,
fucking up.
as well as the railway station. Going down one ramp to the big connection platform, they turned towards another one, leading upwards again, way further up than the one they had just left. They slowed down a bit while walking up the slope, even in the low gravity, a slight change of effort caused them to breathe slightly heavier than before. As they ascended, an ever so slight change of gravity was just about perceivable as they came closer to the center of the station's rotation. Between his huffs, Reprieve commented, "That makes one wonder, if the highest achievable goal isn't for you, what do you want out of your life?" It was hard to believe that Reprieve was personally this interested in his life, so these questions were more than likely also part of his mission. However, James wasn't quite sure what anyone would wish to accomplish with that knowledge. "That's easy. Right now, I want to keep living it," James replied with a smile. The railway station got closer with each step. "I'm not sure I understand," Reprieve said, and sounded honestly confused. "Like I said, it's easy," James answered, and used his sleeve to wipe some sweat off of his forehead. The uniform was just way too warm for this kind of climate, and by now he wasn't used to that anymore. "I've already gotten what I wanted out of life, and I'm where I've always wanted to be. My goal is reached. Now it is about making it worth it. And I'll be a lot happier doing that for the rest of my days instead of getting tangled up in galactic politics. I'll leave that to somebody else." "You've already reached your goal?" Reprieve responded surprisingly, his ears even perking up slightly at the revelation. "Well, most of it," James admitted, paddling back a bit on his pompous declaration. "But the rest will follow in time. I'm on a good course." Reprieve graded, disregarding his sound, and shook his head. "Sounds to me like you need to set high goals for yourself," he said. It almost sounded like the man was mocking him. James shrugged. "Maybe," he mused out loud, looking up towards the station ceiling and smirking. "I guess Sheeta wants to be a captain someday. That could be something interesting to work towards." A quick glance showed him that Reprieve already regretted giving him the idea from the mere thought of that possibility becoming reality. His eyes glazed over for a moment, and he shuddered as his brain worked out the implications of that statement in most likely excruciating detail. Jess, what is your relationship with that woman? Reprieve finally asked irritably, and a small pause before he said woman made James think that he was originally going to use a different word instead. Do you really want to know that? James asked, raising a single eyebrow at the rodent. Forget I asked, Reprieve replied decidedly, just as they had finally reached the top platform where the railway station was located. The big button to the top right first. Wait for the screen to display this field. Enter the code and press the big key with an arrow in it to unlock the screen. Wait for the processor to boot up correctly. Use the mouse gadget to move the arrow, called cursor, across the screen. 2 clicks on the left mouse button activate a program. Activate the program in the 3rd row of the 2nd column. Wait for the program to boot up. Curie repeated the instructions given to them by James in their head as they executed them one by one. On the other side of the table, the rest of the group was going over the earlier events of the day. That is interesting, but if that is true, that might mean we have put the thing in the completely wrong place already, Sheeta said, after watching Quiz's explanation of the strange state they seemed to have found the room of the warrant officer Reprieve in. But I guess we'll have to work with it for now. Going in and getting it now will be way too risky. Maybe we are lucky and it'll pick something up anyway. Curie didn't pay the conversation much mind, as the window on screen was done loading after a few seconds. Looking down at the keyboard, the strange signs of the Irvin alphabet were visible but bore absolutely no meaning to their eyes. They had to go completely off of James's instruction, as well as the few more universally understandable keys while working with the odd piece of technology. Luckily for them, it was still a machine, and every cause and effect was still predictable, even if it lay outside of their understanding for the moment. A change in tone within the conversation made them briefly shift their attention over to it again, although they had already missed some of the necessary
Hello.
context.
Hope you're having a good night.
Weird. To me, that sounds exactly like something happened, Sheeta said, sounding irritated and fixing more with a distrustful gaze. You do know that hiding something from me could get us all into some serious trouble. Curie didn't like the way the conversation got louder, so they quickly concentrated back on the screen in front of them instead, while also slightly lowering the sensitivity of their auditory sensors. The interface of the program showed multiple interactable fields in the light blue. On them there was text, most likely describing what each field's function was. Luckily, as if the program was made to be able to be worked by someone who does not speak the same language as the one it was made in, each field was also marked with small, abstract depictions of their functions. It was slightly odd to figure out what each one was meant to portray. One depicting a camera was fairly obvious. However, another one depicting a strange, cone-shaped object with a square at its tip and tipped over on its side was less clear. Although their curiosity was piqued, and they could not wait to study each of the program's different functions later, right now the only field they had to worry about was the one that James had shown them earlier, marked with a depiction showing something like waves radiating out from one single point in 2 directions, an inaccurate yet effective for its purpose depiction of electromagnetic waves. Clicking on the field, the window portraying the program changed into a different one, portraying yet another different set of fields. Humans apparently enjoyed breaking down even menial tasks into their simplest varieties. Curie kept following the path that had been laid out for them beforehand, until they reached the command window they would have to use for their task. And you were just going to keep that from me? Sheeta said, loud enough that Curie could hear her despite the lowered audio sensitivity, and brought her hands down onto the table while looking at Moore and Pippa angrily. What? Did you want us to find out the hard way? Some of the symbols visible on screen in long, seemingly random strings,
Okay,
most of
give
the
it
symbols
thumbs up.
visible in a single row of keys on the keyboard, apart from dots in between them. Most of them were greyed out and had a red X above, just as grey bars next to them. However, 2 of them were coloured in, the bars next to them being coloured a bright green. It was a fairly intuitive system of showing which connections would be available to the user. One of the connections had to be the gadget, while the other would connect the computer to James's assistant, which he strangely insisted on calling a phone despite it clearly being a computer, just as the one they were using right now. See, this is exactly why we didn't tell you, Pippa protested against Sheeta's agitated expressions. We knew you'd get all riled up about that. What do you mean? Sheeta responded, just as riled up as Pippa feared she would be. I wouldn't have to get angry if you would have just told me in the first place. The 2 not greyed out curves had differing lengths and numbers of symbols contained within them. Hovering the cursor over either of them caused a white information window with black writing within it to pop up that Curie could sadly not decipher. However, they remembered that the code for the phone included fewer characters than the one for the device, so they quickly figured out which of the options to choose. Immediately after clicking the interactable field, It changed its color to a lighter version of the previous one, and the cursor transformed into a spinning symbol, while a new grayed-out bar appearing on the top right of the program's window suddenly filled with a green color. So, the program visualized its progress in loading its applications to the user. Curie tilted the head at that. Even if it was minimal, divulging processing power of the device towards giving completely useless status updates to the user seemed like a waste. He wondered why the human programmers would integrate such a feature, since they clearly had to know that as well. While the bar slowly filled, probably taking longer due to the non-native nature of the device it had to connect to, Curie looked up from the screen, retaining their auditory sensitivity to its normal levels. "Look, we get it, we messed up," Pippa was just saying. Curie had apparently missed some more context of the conversation, as she'd seemed pondering while Moore was breathing heavily, and Chris had moved closer to the middle of the table, and seemingly tried to appear taller than usual. Also, the conversation had seemingly returned to more acceptable volumes. "Well, as long as you know that much," she just said without looking up at Pippa, keeping her hand in front of her mouth while talking and looking to the ground. "Anyway, are you sure that is what he said, Moore? Because it sounds mighty suspicious to me."
You think so?
Moore said ruminatively, and brought one of her big claws to her neck.
It all sounded fairly natural to me.
"That is because you're about as cunning as a plush toy," Cheetah replied. "You know, a simple yes would have been enough," Pippa commented on Cheetah's reply. Curie lowered their eyes onto the screen again. The cursor had returned to its previous form. The filling bar had apparently disappeared after it had been completely filled up, and was replaced by a new window opening within the program window. Windows and fields appeared to be the preferred form for any underlying function in human programs, or maybe it was a quirk of this particular programmer who developed this program, leaving his signature in its function. The window itself showed nothing but a dark blue screen surrounded by a grey frame, on the top right of which was an interactable red button, showing an X was visible. A similar frame surrounded nearly all windows that opened on the computer. Curie had observed it before in the program James used to play the movie. And in the middle of the dark blue screen there was a white, isosceles triangle, its tip pointing towards the right side of the screen. Another symbol Curie already knew. It symbolized play footage among the Earth symbols. Curie wondered why such an odd shape was chosen for such a meaning, as they could see no correlation between the shape and its function. However, as everything when it came to humanity seemed to be, at least it was standardized, and easy to discern given a bit of practice or explanation. Curie double-clicked on the button. For a second it got bigger and disappeared from the screen, but was then immediately replaced by two white bars appearing on the screen, which also got bigger for a moment, before disappearing, just like the play symbol, which probably took its old place once more. At least the dark blue screen had been replaced with a single still frame of the footage the camera within the device had picked up. However, they were going to need more than that. Curie tilted their head at the program's odd behavior and double-clicked the play button again. The same thing happened with the symbols appearing for split seconds before returning to its old status, although it was again showing a single new frame of the camera's feed. What was happening? 2 clicks meant execute with this computer, so why wasn't it executing? They would have to figure it out. Testing the double-click a few more times resulted in the same result, so the effect was reproducible, meaning it was most likely not a mistake, but intended. Curie tilted the head again, this time in the other direction. 2 clicks meant execute. 2 clicks caused the program to display footage very shortly before pausing it again. Was that the intended function of the program? Was it maybe an error in the programming? However, they did not know the language used for this program, and even if they did, they could not work with the symbols on the keyboard at all. And they didn't know how to enter the program's code to fix any possible mistakes. But they still had to get it to run. That was their only task right now. They had to figure it out. Using the red X at the top of the window, they closed the subroutine of the program and reopened it shortly after. They then tried the double-click again. Same reaction. They closed the entire program, again reopening it shortly after and maneuvering back to the window. Same reaction. Curie started to slide the stick into place. The next step was to restart the entire computer. Hopefully the machine was quick and it wouldn't take long. Once the screen had turned black once more, Curie could hear the conversation once again for a moment. "You can see how it works when it's on the computer," Curie said, and their tail started to sway around. Pippa, who had by now straightened up to her full height, replied, "It certainly wouldn't hurt. Besides, to just not say something entirely unnecessary is not mincing words." Curie swayed around stronger. They had to finish their task. The computer booted back up. They entered the code again. The orientation screen would turn up. Double-click the program. Double-click the radio wave symbol. Double-click the next field. codes indicating the different devices. Double-click the code of the device. The bar reappeared and only slowly started to fill.
Why don't we all step back and cool off for a moment?
Moore suggested, bringing her huge arms up to make calming gestures. Both Pippa and Sheila looked at her agitatedly, and seemingly wanted to reply something. However, the bar had once again filled and been replaced with a window with a play button. Quickly, Curie double-clicked it. Same effect. Curie's body tension dropped, causing them to slightly slump down, putting their face away from the screen, and they started to sway harder. They double-clicked again and again, always the same result. But swaying. By now, they were using their brain trying to find different solutions to the problem, whether their brain didn't give them any. If it was one of their usual technical or programming problems, they would have a variety of things to try and find the problem, but in this case, they weren't even sure what the problem was. Double-click meant execute for this computer, so why did it just not work? Their arms and legs began to tremble as they pulled them closer to their body in their sways and could feel themselves losing their grip on the mouse. However, a voice right next to their face reached through to them. "But what are you swaying around for?" Sheila, whose face had suddenly appeared out of nowhere, curiously looked at the screen of the computer asked, "How's the focus on the camera?" Curie looked at her, then back at the screen. They thought about it. What had made Sheila angry earlier was not being told when things went wrong. Not telling that something went wrong was not lying, but she behaved like she had been lied to. Curie remembered that they had heard of that once. Lying by omission, people called it, and Curie was no liar. "It doesn't work," they stated, their voice ringing out flatly from a synthesizer. "The device doesn't work," Sheila asked dryly, and looked at the screen again, which still showed a single still frame of the footage. "No, it's not the device," Curie replied. "The program doesn't work." Around them, the other eyes of the table started to be pointed towards them. They didn't like that. "Why, what's wrong with it?" Sheila asked and looked a bit closer, as the program showed no error that would be obvious to her. Curie took a tight grip of the mouse and demonstrated. "I don't know," they said, bringing the cursor up to the play button. "Double-clicking means execute, but every time I tell the program to execute, it just does this." With that, they double-clicked, showing the irritating swapping of symbols correlating with the switching of the still frame. Sheila said, and looked at the problem for a second. Then, without saying another word, she reached across Curie for the mouse, causing Curie to pull their leg, which they were using to manipulate the device with, back. Sheila brought the cursor back onto the button, and clicked the mouse a single time. As always, the button grew in size for a moment and then faded out. However, the rest of the effect remained missing. Instead, the program started to properly execute the playing footage, the camera feed running as a smooth, constant video, even though nothing in the feed actually changed. "There we go," Sheila said, putting her hand back and crossing her arms. "Crystal clear." Curie looked at the flawlessly running program in disbelief. "But why?" they whispered, as the program suddenly executing with a single click after a double click had meant execute in every previous window made no sense. "I don't know," Sheila said, lifting her shoulders and leaning back a bit. "But it works now, so don't worry about it." Then she leaned back forward to take a closer look at the video. "Although we probably won't be seeing anything as long as they're still out, I guess," she added with a sigh. But Curie was not just yet ready to let it go. A single click had sufficed where a double click meant execute. Testing a hypothesis, Curie reached for the mouse and gave the screen another single click. Immediately, the two bars appeared for a moment before fading out and the time froze, before the large play button appeared in its middle once again. And another click caused it to play again. So instead of a double click commanding the program to run, process, play video feed, it instead just changed the already running progress of the program from play feed to pause feed. In hindsight, it was fairly obvious. But why had James told them that a double click meant execute then? Following a hunch they had, Curie now also reached for the largest button on the computer's keyboard. "The movie has started with this button. Want to be the one to do it when it's time?" James had said, back then. And just as it had started the movie, the large button also changed the state of the program from playing to pausing, just like a mouse click did. So not only was the function different, but it was also routed to different controls. Just what was the human who had programmed this thing? Everything about human design was usually fixated on intuitive controls, so why this diversion from the norm? "You done?" Sheila asked from behind them, after she had watched them experiment with the controls for a while. "I have to figure it out," Curie mumbled, while they decided how best to follow an alien's thought process in designing such an application. "Right," Sheila said dismissively, before leaning her face in towards Curie's again. But we are supposed to watch that right now, and we can't do that with you pausing it every few seconds. So you'll have to figure it out later. Maybe James can explain it to you once he gets back. Curie looked up at her, tilting their head. Right, they said, and remembered that they were only borrowing the computer from James. It would be right to do anything with it that he would not want. Sheeta took the liberty of picking the portable computer up and bringing it over to the rest of the group, indicating for Curie to follow after her. Now everyone crowded around, trying to get a good view of the tiny screen. However, the footage still showed the same thing it had always shown, paused or not paused, an empty room. Well, then again, I guess we don't need to all sit around and watch nothing happening all day, Sheeta said dully, after a few minutes of watching the eventless footage. No point in all of us wasting our lives.
And is this you, one, going to be the one wasting yours?
Moore asked, the much smaller woman with a strange and distrustful look. Emma also looked at me similarly. Only Chris seemed to see no problem with what she was saying. Well, one of us has to do it. I'm not going to let any of you run around with James's computer, Sheeta replied in a sharp tone. So you can run along. I'll let you know if anything comes up. However, none of them seemed willing to just go away to Curie.
And what makes you think we are not trustworthy enough to handle James's computer?
Moore responded to the smaller woman loudly. Yeah, what do you mean you won't let us run around with it? Pippa supported the older woman. She'd have made that smacking some of her tongue she so often made. Well, if either of you has it, I'd constantly have to be afraid of it being stolen somewhere. You're not the most attentive after all, She'd said with a strange smile on her face. It didn't quite match what she had just said, found Curie. Also, I literally live with James right now. There is also that. And how do we know you're not going to break it? Pippa replied to Sheeta, and stomped one of her feet on the ground. You're not the most careful after all. Sheeta gave her a dark glare. I am more than careful enough, she said explicitly. Also, this thing was made for humans. It's designed for people like me. How are you two even going to use it with your giant hands? At that, Moore spoke up, loudly shaking out her fur beforehand.
Oh, come now, we just have to watch the screen, she said, with a rough voice, and kept shaking her head. Besides, both of us are used to precision in our work. We have to do everything very precisely after all.
Curie was confused. Hadn't they just called the task of watching the feed as wasting one's life? Why were they now fighting over doing it? Not wanting the fight to continue, and also feeling the need to point out some inaccuracies in their assessment of the situation, Curie spoke up. Actually, it should be me who obsessed the computer, not any of you. All eyes at the table shot towards Curie, as they candidly looked back at their company. As everyone had seemingly lost their voice for a moment, it was Chris who replied to them first. What makes you say that? They signed, and interestedly tilted their heads sideways. James entrusted the computer to me. I was the one he taught how to use it, they stated matter-of-factly, as they didn't want to seem like they were merely joining the fight. James had given the computer to Sheeta, but with the explicit purpose of handing it over to them, so it was on them to fulfill this task. I am also the only one who knows the code to reactivate it, should it be shut off for any reason at any point. Besides, I do not mind watching the footage until James returns. I do not see it as a waste of time.
Well, that is...
Moore started, but apparently couldn't find any more words than that. Yeah, I got nothing, Pippa agreed, and stroked some of her fur that had become slightly disheveled back into place. Well, I can't exactly leave you alone with it either, Sheeta mumbled, leaning her cheek on one of her hands, which slightly slurred her speech. Agitatedly, Moore turned towards Sheeta again.
You cannot be serious right now, the large woman boomed at Sheeta. Do you really think you could do a better job than Curie in this case? I am sure they would not leave it out of their sight.
Sheeta audibly sighed at that and just slightly tilted her head towards Moore, instead of looking at her straight on. Come off it, Grandma, that's not what I meant, she said dismissively, apparently lacking either energy or drive to start a more passionate argument again. What I mean is, I can't leave Curie alone, period. I figured they'd stay around anyway, exactly because James gave the computer specifically to them. You can't leave Curie alone, Pippa piped on, looking at Sheeta confusedly. Why? It is merely a precaution, Curie answered in Sheeta's stead. She and James figured today may be an especially dangerous day for me. And why is that? Chris asked, their head tilting to a different side this time, as everyone's gaze turned into a concerned one. Call it paranoia, Sheeta answered this time, stretching as he spoke. But with James being officially ordered away, we felt it might be an opportune time for anyone looking for a chance to get at Curie, so we wanted to tighten the security a bit. I know it doesn't make much sense, but it is what we decided on, just to be safe.
And you did not tell us about that,
Moore said indignantly, her eyes and nostrils widening at the revelation. Sheeta sank back down into her previous position. I told you the part of the plan you were involved with. Watching Curie is on me, not on you. No point in worrying you with stuff like that when you get anxious so easily, she replied listlessly. There it was again. Line by mission. Shashid had been doing it herself. Then again, I already knew Sheila didn't mind lying. Well, now, we can't leave you alone. What if something happens? Pippa burst out agitatedly, one of her feet now rhythmically stomping the ground. Sheila looked at her incredulously. Think about it. Do you actually want to be around when something happens? She asked, unbelievingly. At Curie being so inclined, they might also have noticed a hint of mockery in Sheila's voice. But the question did seem to make Pippa think. Who, however, answered immediately was Moore.
No, I do not. Well, that does not mean I can just leave after having heard that,
the large woman said, and decidedly walked around the table to sit back down at her previous position.
Sometimes we have to do things that we do not wish to do.
Pippa nodded comfortingly and did the same. Quist, who it seemed to Curie had never had any intentions of leaving in the first place, merely remained in place, looking towards them curiously. Curie settled down at the table, passively looking at everyone one after another. It seemed everyone was staying. Earlier everyone said it would be a waste of time. Then he had fought over who would stay, and now everyone stayed. Curie didn't understand why all of that had been necessary, even though now nothing had changed from before. Suit yourself, she'd said dismissively. Just don't go around whining afterwards. Most likely nothing is going to happen. That's exactly why I'm staying around after all, so nothing will happen. Moore defiantly exhaled heavily out of her nose, as she decided to absently stare at the screen, with everyone else just sitting quietly. The atmosphere at the table was heavy, as the soothing mechanical humming of the computer's fan filled the air. After a few minutes of nothing happening, she loudly exhaled, the air forcing her lips apart with a plopping sound.
Hi, babe.
So, she said, briefly looking up from the computer screen. Anyone can think of something to do?
Hi, baby. Come here, babe. Want more snuggles? Want to go out? Alright, let's check the window, see if it's still raining. Be right back. Hi there. Come here.
Shop all our locked-in low prices now at walmart.ca/locked-in-low-prices.
Want to go? Okay.
The Scarlet King. Extraterrestrial and extra-dimensional threats border on the commonplace in the SCP universe. And the SCP Foundation spends a great amount of time, effort, and resources containing, or at least preventing, these threats from wiping out our existence. There are entities within the SCP universe that we would liken to gods, some of them contained by the Foundation and some of them not. But one of the most mysterious and potentially world-threatening is the Scarlet King. The Scarlet King is one of the older concepts on the SCP Wiki, but is one largely wrapped up in an air of mystery, with hints of his true nature spread across the site. Due to the lack of canon within the SCP universe, ultimately the Scarlet King is whatever you believe him to be, but I'll go over some of the myths and perspectives related to this eldritch figure. To begin with, we have to go back to where it started, with SCP-231. On the surface, SCP-231 is a young girl, designated 231-7, who is pregnant with some sort of entity. Her and 6 other young girls were found in a police raid on an organization that called itself the Children of the Scarlet King. Each of the girls were pregnant, and 24 hours after the raid, one of the girls went into labor, giving birth to something.
I don't care. I'm still trying to finish the first story. 25. There we go.
Thief! A scream rang out, piercing through the white noise and chatter of the busy street of the station. Stop her! The The sound of quickly running hooves pounding on the station's metal floor, punctuated by aghast shouts and yells from passers-by, as they were involuntarily involved in the ongoing incident, either by being pushed out of the way, or used as brief stepping stones for the nimble creature tearing through the crowd at high speed. Hot on her trail were two other sets of footsteps, one very regular, rhythmically hitting the floor every second while taking long strides, the other characterized but further spread out, hard bumps on the floor, as their owner quickly hopped along. Raprik had trouble keeping his eyes on the back of the running thief in the crowd of much larger people around him. And not only her. Even though the freak was usually sticking out like a sore thumb amongst normal people, he had lost sight of even him in the sheer chaos around them. But he also couldn't concentrate on that right now. Both of them had bolted without much thought once they had heard the first cry for help and spotted the culprit. However, she was a fast beast, and it wasn't easy catching up to her. A Kez theory, if Raprik had seen correctly, and judging by her height and barely developed antlers, it was a young woman. Not that that mattered too much among those ne'er-do-wells. She tore through the crowd with reckless abandon, a small stature allowing her to slip through the people, most of which were caught unaware by what was happening through them. Of course, Raprik himself wasn't any larger than the young scoundrel. However, he did have a few more qualms about getting too up close and personal with random strangers, causing him to, more often than not, take a slightly longer way through the crowd than the escaping criminal. If only so many of the civilians weren't staying around and gawking, it would make way for the delinquent to be apprehended easier instead. He would have caught up with her in no time. He kept his eyes trained on the long, snow-white stripe along the crook's back, interrupted by the straps of many bags and pouches she had fastened to her body, one of which most likely contained the stolen goods. It was easily her most standout feature and allowed him to quickly identify her in the crowd, even now. She also kept glancing back at him, surely worried that he would sooner or later close the gap. No doubt she recognized Sippersleg, and knew that this chase would not go on for long should she not get a long way out of his reach soon. "Stop right there!" Raprik yelled out, bounding around a group of shocked bystanders she had just shoved and squeezed her way through. "You have no chance anyway, so spare us the charade." "Very funny, slowpoke," the thief yelled back, and sounding astonishingly confident, even though the distance between her and her pursuer had clearly shortened significantly since the chase had begun. Was it possible that she was planning something, or was she merely trying to unsettle him? As if he was just a piece of furniture, the rogue jumped and ran across the back of a quadrupedally walking Korshishi, causing the man to shoot his long neck around to look at what had just trampled on him like that. This gave Raprik an opening to walk around him while his head was out of the way. However, to his surprise, she made a sharp turn immediately afterwards, catching him off guard and forcing him to waste precious moments slowing his momentum and skittering across the floor while adjusting his direction to hurry after her. Was this her great escape plan? If so, it was pretty laughable. Sure, it had given her a slight head start, but it wouldn't work again now that he was anticipating it. And in fact, it may lose her ground should she try that one more time, as Raprik was fairly sure he could take sharp turns more easily than her. Yet apparently she seemed determined to make the little bit of room she had won for herself count. It was surprising that she could sprint even faster than before, but not at all a problem. Then she took another turn. This time he was ready for it and cut the corner, closing in on her. It was a full success, and he was now close enough to hear her mumble under her breath. He didn't understand what she was saying. However, what he did manage to pick up on was her reaching into one of her many pouches. The movement was followed by a quick jerking of her arm, and shortly after, by a metal clank. What the? Raprik thought, but it was cut short by the thing the girl had dropped, fulfilling its purpose, suddenly ringing out with a loud bang and bursting open, near instantly covering a considerable area around Raprik and the girl in a hazy, white smoke, obscuring his vision. The chemical felt strange in his eyes and almost immediately stuffed his trunk uncomfortably, even though it had no scent of his own. Not only that, but the brief explosion, even minor as it was enough to stir up panic in the people around them. Combining that with them suddenly losing their vision, chaos broke out abruptly, with panic-stricken people inevitably stumbling into each other, trying to get to safety or find out what was happening to them. Many talked over each other, and judging by the agitated voices, it appeared that some had even run into each other in the confusion, only visible to him as some hazy outlines and wavy silhouettes in the smoke. A fine mess the miscreant had caused there. And all that, just so she could get away with the petty people. What a load of filth. Hopefully someone could say all around this. She better pray to whatever the people believed in, that none of the bystanders were injured around here, or she would learn just how the law dealt with lowlives, who just didn't know when they were outmatched. His instincts told Raprik that he was completely concealed on all sides by the smoke, making it hard to focus on the intensity of the situation. However, in his mind, he knew that such a small device could certainly not cover a wide enough area to have much of an effect. Quickly he pressed forward, avoiding the people still blindly stumbling through the smoke and trying to clumsily find their way, while he swiftly moved towards the direction she had disappeared in. Surely the border of the smoke-covered area could not be far. Once he was out, he would just have to catch up again. He'd show her to underestimate him. However, he would not get his chance to do that, as he wasn't the only one that had been underestimated. As he threw what he see the light around him into fire, the density of the smoke rising from his edges, he could hear the voice of the thief ring in a surprised yelp. Quickly he sped up even further, and within mere moments, he broke out of the cloud of smoke, pulling only Trousley behind him into the open. Immediately, his eyes raced across his surroundings, trying to locate the fleeing girl. But, as he quickly found out, she was fleeing no more. Only paces away from him was the rabble, looking pretty bewildered while she was suspended in mid-air by a strong arm wrapped around her waist area that had apparently snatched her off her feet as she tried to escape out of the cover of smoke. The fine gold heel and still visibly scarred cuts along his forearm were promptly on display now that he had taken the jacket of his uniform. The thieves' winded expression told of a rather sudden stop she had been brought to by her capturer, and it seemed that she needed a moment to come to terms with the situation she so unexpectedly found herself. The multiple pointy flaps of her ears moved independently from each other, trying to gather as much information about her surroundings as possible, while her eyes were busy studying the strange, hairless being that had so effortlessly stopped her dead in her tracks. "Gotcha," the human happily announced to the thief, as he looked back at her with a grin, his exposed fangs seemingly giving the girl hope for a moment. Reprieve looked at the freak astonishedly. When in the good graces had he even gotten in front of him? He had noticed the man disappearing at some point, but he had expected they had just shaken him by accident. "Good work, Reprieve," the freak laughed, turning his attention away from the girl, whom he still held up like a sack of sand, and looked over towards Reprieve, while he was just using the moment of calmness to try and rid his trunk of the leftovers of the irritating smoke. He didn't exactly know what work he had done well. After all, James had acted completely out of his own planning. He assumed that he also acted completely out of James. You better look at the strange sight before him. The freak didn't acknowledge his answer, instead already looking back at his recent capture. "Quite the reckless maneuver there, miss," he said in an uncertainly cheerful tone that was an utter mismatch to the situation. People could have gotten hurt. Was that all he had to say? Being directly addressed apparently ripped the little filter out of her shock-induced stupor, as she quickly shook her head and brought her eyes back to the situation at hand. "Spike don't hurt anybody," she squealed out, and immediately started uselessly squirming in James's grasp, causing the man to look at her almost pitifully. However, it was clear that she would not get out of his hold like that any time soon. "No, it doesn't, but panic does," Reprieve reprimanded, looking up at the struggling thief. "Your heedless actions cause great distress to many good people, and don't try to tell me you don't know that yourself." For a moment, James flashed him an almost surprised look before a more violent squirm from the lowlife demanded his attention. The girl now shot Reprieve a poisonous glare, before trying to push herself away from James, to no avail. "May have considered it," she admitted under her breath, as she slowly but surely realised that she wouldn't be able to wriggle out of this quite so easily. "It's not my fault if people lose their heads over a wee bit of smoke." What an annoying accent. She was going to talk nonsense. Couldn't she at least do so comprehensively?
There we go.
"Well, that is only half true if you're the one throwing smoke grenades around in the first place," James replied with a dismissive smile on his face. Somehow, despite being the one that caught the thief, he didn't seem to be taking the situation all too seriously. However, the unsettling nature of his face and his dark, relentlessly staring eyes at least had the positive effect of making the criminal seriously consider before doing anything rash. "Wouldn't have had to if you two softies wouldn't have gone and chased me round all of a sudden," the thief responded.
Jesus
quietly,
fuck, it's in here.
annoyedly flicking the asynchronous ears in the process. "She has some nerve," Reprieve said, angrily blurted out, looking at James, who still seemed to be more amused than stern. "Well, you can't argue with her logic," James replied with a short bout of his low laughter, while also getting a better grip of the girl by briefly throwing and then re-grabbing her in place, causing her to let out a surprised yelp. "You can't be serious," Reprieve grumbled at James, flicking his trunk up while he spoke to make his dissatisfaction known. "She is a criminal, and you really want to let her shift the blame onto us?" "She is also right here and can be talked to directly," the thief had the gall to complain, while she was still being held like an unruly toddler by the freakish primate. "Also, I can stand myself just fine. You don't have to log me around like a sack of shite." James took a long look at the girl over his shoulder, and an even wider grin crept across his face. "Oh, I like you." The seemingly most unqualified ambassador of the entire galaxy dribbled. Then he so lowered her so that her hooves had solid ground under them once again, before adding, "But don't you go running off on us again. Next time, you lose your standing privileges." Fine, you got me," she said, dusting herself off and tidying up her messy fur, while also taking a step away from the human. "In that case, hand over your stolen goods already, before you get any good ideas," Reprieve said, stepping over to the Filcher and stretching out an open hand, awaiting her compliance. "If you cooperate from now on, there may be a possibility for a reduced sentence in it for you." The girl turned her head around and narrowed her eyes at him. "I was talking to the muscle over here," she said dismissively, and lifted her nose, showing no signs of wanting to cooperate. "I'd have gone away from you, slow-bogey littly spit." Clearly, she was not quite comprehending the position she was in. James apparently couldn't quite help himself and visibly enjoyed watching the miscreant insult Reprieve. However, in the end, he shook his head and also extended his open palm. "Come on now, hand him over," he casually ordered, and moved his fingers in a beckoning gesture. She looked at the man contemplatively, but apparently decided that there was nothing she could do. Opening her pouches and bag, she brought forth a variety of valuables, as well as other random items. Personal technological devices from different planets, pieces of jewelry, and other small trinkets of questionable value, including a pack of tissues. James whistled through his teeth while taking the items, immediately either handing them off to Reprieve or carefully discarding them on the floor. "That's quite the impressive haul," he said, and he honestly sounded impressed. The rage nearly shook Reprieve's entire body, making his fur rustle. Here he had just started to gain a modicum of respect for the freak, all for naught. "You can't be serious," he exclaimed, stomping one of his feet and almost dropping one of the valuable items James had pawned off on him. He quickly re-grabbed it before it fell, but that meant he had to regain his composure while James looked at him, ambiguously with puckered lips. "You do realize we are talking to a criminal here?" James sighed audibly. "Calm your trunk, Reprieve," the freak said, and it sounded a lot more annoyed than conciliatorily, especially with him rolling his eyes. "I can very well tell right from wrong myself, and I clearly don't plan to let her get away with it. I just never expected to meet a pickpocket out in space, and such a well-equipped one at that." His voice mellowed out a bit as he spoke, and in the end he merely shrugged with a casual smile. Reprieve shook his head at that clear display of sheer disregard for the situation. However, at least he apparently knew about his severity, even if he outwardly didn't let on that much. "She's probably a professional if I had to guess," he said, moving on from James's other comments and throwing another dark look at the lowlife. "I wouldn't be surprised if security finds an extensive record for her once they look into it." Speaking of security, they sure were taking their sweet time to get here. "I gotta put food in my belly somehow," the thief truthfully mumbled, while finally holding Reprieve's gaze but avoiding that of James. "Gotta eat to live," James agreed candidly, with another shrug. However, his tone soon after changed to a surprisingly more serious one. "But I didn't think anyone would have to go hungry in the community." The girl seemed surprised at his change of tone and quickly glanced at him. However, Reprieve was quick to answer James's inquiry for her. "That's because they don't, but some choose to anyway," he explained crossly, while letting his sheer distaste for these vile people seep into his voice. James seemed to be confused at that statement, rightfully so. Clearly he was aware of the extensive helps that the community gave out to all of its citizens. However, the certain type of people they were dealing with right now was a bit more out of the general well of knowledge. "Yeah, by taking arms and going to exile," she basically spat at Reprieve, her words sheer venom, and James could only look on in even more confusion. "I think I'm better off getting by on my own. Thank you very much. Then at least I can go back home once the world has finally managed to beat me down." "Wait, exile?" James asked apprehensively, while looking back and forth between the two of them. The girl let out another half through her nose, while Reprieve was once again faster with his reply. "She is a Kesdir, therefore a Class 2, lack of essential resources and hyper-competitive evolution," he listed off in an individuous tone, while giving the girl the side-eye. "Her people have long been known as troublemakers. Even though the wide wealth of resources amongst the stars has been open to them for years and years now, they still seem to think that it is the Dark Ages and everyone has to survive for themselves. And if they don't, they are seen as outcasts." "I can talk for myself, you know that?" the thief blurted out, and took an almost threatening step towards Reprieve with an angry visage. However, she quickly thought better of it and dropped her display. Her 3 large nostrils still flared annoyedly. "That is quite something," James mumbled thoughtfully, ignoring the threatening display before him and apparently becoming lost in his own thoughts, bringing one hand to his chin. Reprieve wiggled his trunk a bit while dismissively turning away from the lowlife. There's no need to get worked up over it, he said in a resigned tone, lifting his hands to imitate the human shrugging. It is their own fault. They choose this life like this and won't accept any help offered to them by the community. They have no one to blame but themselves. James didn't quite seem to hear what he said, simply acknowledging it with a quick, ambiguous sound. You're making it quite easy for yourself, the thief grumbled deeply. Yeah, James mumbled. But Reprik wasn't sure if he was confirming what the girl had said or just finishing his last thought out loud. Either way, the human ambassador turned towards the girl purposely right after that, and very directly asked her, "What is your name, by the way?" The girl blinked confusedly in his direction for a moment before answering. "They call me Sky." James raised his eyebrows at that in an earnest look of surprise. "Sky? Your name is Sky?" he asked in seeming disbelief. "Yeah? What about it?" The girl bluffed back at him. "Nothing," James said, audibly exhaling some air through his nose and shaking his now hanging head. "Just a strange coincidence, I guess." Then he snapped back up and looked at Reprik with a strange expression. "Sorry, Reprik, but I should probably skedaddle now," he said conciliatorily. And supposedly it sounded like he was actually sorry about it. "Do you mind handling the staff with the security again? You know, my track record with them. Also, I'm running out of time for my date later and should really get going now." Reprik looked at him for a moment before replying. "I take it you don't wish to testify against that girl, even though she is clearly guilty?" James laughed awkwardly and scratched the back of his head. "You know me too well," he admitted with an embarrassed smile, and squeezed his eyes shut. "Besides, if her guilt is that clear, my testimony shouldn't be necessary. I only caught her after the act, after all." Reprik had to take a deep breath at that. Just what was going on in the head of that man? He could mostly guess the directions his mind was going, but never how it got there in the first place. "Sure, go on ahead. I'll do with the aftermath," he finally volunteered, while rubbing his forehead with one hand. This was better either way. It didn't get the target involved in any petty altercations that could complicate things down the line. James took a deeper bow and loudly proclaimed, "Thank you very much. I owe you one." Then he quickly turned towards that Sky girl. "Don't make any more trouble, please," he said, exceedingly courteously. "And farewell, Sky." The petty thief pulled her head back in surprise, and many ears fluttering excitedly. "Farewell," she replied meekly. James smiled at her before turning on his heels and rushing away from the scene, leaving the valuables he had collected from the girl laying discarded on the ground. "Success to you," he shouted behind him as he hurried off. "Success to you," Reprik and surprisingly also the girl replied simultaneously. Reprik looked after his target for a few more seconds. A strange creature he was indeed. And he wasn't the only one. "Well, that was quite a bit easier than I expected," the thief commented while staring after James. Annoyed, Reprik turned towards her. "What are you talking about?" he asked, while shaking her a venomous glare. However, the girl was ignoring him and rummaging through one of her pouches. Quickly, Reprik rushed over, grabbing her hand and violently yanking it out of the pocket before she could bring forth another one of her villainous gadgets. "Ouch, hey!" she yelped up, struggling against his grip, but failing just as miserably as she had against James. "Watch it, you're hurting me!" However, Reprik looked at her hands that were still holding on to whatever she was trying to pull out of her pocket. However, there was something he didn't expect. A communicator, he thought to himself, staring at her. Who the hell did she want to contact? Accomplices? With him right in front of her face? However, two things happened simultaneously. At exactly the same time, both the communicator in the thief's hand and his own personal attendant came to life and loudly announced that someone was trying to contact them. A coincidence? No. But it's well time for that. Hesitantly, he looked down towards his wrist, while his arm was slightly moved by the failed attempts of the girl to break his "Don't you want to get that, Slowpoke?" the lowlife smugly asked him, looking strangely triumphant. This was all very peculiar. Also, he had stayed behind to deal with the security, but where were they anyway? There was a large smoking explosion right in the middle of the street, so even if no one alerted him, they should definitely right on the road by now. Moving deliberately slowly, he reached over to his assistant without letting go of the girl and accepted the call.
Alright, Bobbins on thread, I'm done.
He asked loud and clear. He noticed that the thief had now
Alright,
also
good night.
wished to accept the call on her communicator, and as he had already feared, Ivory's voice now answered out of both devices simultaneously. Strange effect with her already unusual voice overlapping with itself. "Would you believe it, our little rascal, Reprik? She did her part